Hi, welcome back to Tech Tip Tuesday. Today we're going to talk about some terms within kind of quilt pattern writing that are a little bit ambiguous, why they're ambiguous, and what to use instead. Because a lot of times you're just writing your pattern and it makes perfect sense to you, but when somebody else reads it back, they're like, hang on, I don't really understand what that means, right? And so they'll assume it means one thing and follow it to the letter, or at least they think they are, and end up with a piece that looks completely different from what you'd envisioned. And so word choice here and just making sure that you have enough information in there is really important to make sure that your reader doesn't have the opportunity to interpret the instructions differently and thus kind of screw up the quilt that they're making, which is what you don't want. You don't want any confusion. You don't want any room for interpretation. You want people to be able to follow the quilt pattern and know exactly what they're meant to do in order to make the quilt on the front. That's why they bought the pattern. So let's kick things off with the first term that I see a ton in the patterns that I tech edit, and that is just saying something to the tune of mark a diagonal line. And usually this is used to kind of talk about marking a corner to corner diagonal across the back of a square that you're then going to do with a 2 at a time HSTs method or a stitch and flip method, right? Something along those lines. What people don't realize is that there's actually many diagonal lines that you can mark, whereas you want specifically the one that's from corner to corner, not just any old diagonal line, right? This is a diagonal line. You've marked a diagonal line on the wrong side of the fabric, but it's not the one you want. So including that mark a diagonal line corner to corner can be really helpful so that people know exactly where it's going. This is less important if you have a diagram to accompany with it, right? But if you're writing a more advanced pattern and you're not including all of those little marking steps that you're just kind of assuming people know, more so important to include that corner to corner terminology in the actual instructions itself. Alrighty, let's look at the next one. This is, again, something that I see a lot. It's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, and this comes from like quilt patterns of yesteryear, like patterns that are 10 to 15 years old, as well as kind of designers that have been writing for a while. This used to be very, very common terminology, but it's not actually correct English, which is part of why it bothers me. But it's also for newer quilters that are self-taught. They're not really used to reading patterns. They're just kind of picking it up as they go, which there are a lot more of now that we've kind of passed through COVID and there's been this reinvigoration into the quilting hobby. It's kind of important to have a little bit more instruction here. And so what I'll see a lot of are just press to dark, press towards piece A, open and press, right? Like that action of taking your HSTs or your pieces that are right sides together and opening them up and then pressing your seam. All of those kinds of different ways of saying the same thing are really ambiguous because, first of all, opening and pressing something is just too easily confused with like pressing the seam open. And also, we always assume that you're kind of unfolding those right sides together pieces when you're quilting. That's just taken for granted. That's an assumed thing in all quilt patterns. So there's no real need to remind people to do that. And it's too easily confused with pressing seam open. So just kind of cross that one off your list. If you're used to telling people to open and then press, just get rid of that. Just say press and give a direction, right? Press to dark is not correct English. Press what to dark? And you're not pressing it to dark, you're pressing it towards dark, right? Dark fabric, dark hole. There's not enough information there, right? We're missing some subjects. And so a better way to say that is press seams toward the dark fabric or press seam towards the dark fabric, right? There's a little bit of grammar there as to whether or not you have the S. Usually you only want an S in one of those things, right? So it's either seams and then the other one's singular or vice versa. And press towards piece A, again, is missing a subject there. We need to have press seams toward piece A. And so these are really little things. They don't have a huge impact, but it's just with very, very new quilters that haven't read a lot of quilt patterns, these little things are just kind of like, I think that's what they mean, but I'm not really sure. Like, what the heck does that mean? It just adds this extra layer of mental calories that's needed when they're reading your quilt pattern, which is not what we want, right? We want the pattern to be very easy to read, very easy to understand, very easy to follow, and fun to make. And so having all of these little extra things that just leave a little bit of question mark in the back of your reader's mind is not really great. Just get into the habit of talking about pressing seams towards a fabric, not to a fabric, okay? All right, number 3 is about trimming. And again, this kind of comes into play when we're talking about a stitch and flip corner. A lot of times I'll see trim a 1/4 inch away from the seam. Well, you've got a seam and you've got two sides to it, right? Because we sewed a whole square on there. And so you could trim a 1/4 inch on the outside, or you could trim a 1/4 inch away from the seam on the inside. Which one are we talking about? Obviously, if you've been quilting for a while, you want to trim a 1/4 inch to the outside of the seam, right? But again, very beginner quilters may misinterpret that. And it's just something stupid. As soon as they do it, they'll be like, hang on, that wasn't right. I am such an idiot, right? But you don't want to leave that opportunity for them, even if it's just a stupid mistake that most people aren't going to make. Just stick that little word in there, trim to the outside of the seam, and everything goes away. It's fewer mental calories, it's easier to read, and there's no ambiguity there. Alrighty, the last one that I've got is about talking about finished units versus completed units. The reason this one's a little bit ambiguous, and I'll be honest, I don't split hairs on this when I'm tech editing because I don't think a lot of people get these confused, but you will hear this feedback from some tech editors, which is why I bring it up. And that is that a finished unit is too easily confused with finished versus unfinished dimensions, right? And so if we're talking about finished dimensions, those are always a 1/2 inch smaller than the unfinished dimensions. And so when you're talking about a unit that is complete, right, you're done working with it and it's ready to move on to the next step, it's better to call that a completed unit rather than a finished unit because it's not finished. It still has its seam allowances on it. You're going to be dealing with unfinished dimensions. And so there's just too much room for confusion there. It's better to call it a completed unit, right? This is the completed HST unit. It will measure 2.5 inches square. The finished dimensions, right, are not going to be 2.5 inches. They're going to be 2 inches. And so kind of swapping that finished term out and using completed instead just removes that opportunity for any confusion. Alrighty, those are kind of 4 of the ambiguous terms I see a lot in quilt patterns. None of these are going to make or break your pattern, right? It's just kind of best practices. Something to think about. Again, the vast majority of your customers are not going to get these terms confused because they're just so used to reading quilt patterns. It's really the newer quilters and the folks that are self-taught and haven't read a lot of quilt patterns that might start to get confused. And again, any opportunity to kind of reduce that mental calorie load in reading your pattern is a really good thing. It's going to make your pattern that much more enjoyable and seamless for your customer, which is a really good thing. Alrighty, that's all I've got for today. I will see you next week for Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya.